All right, our next speaker is Molly Marenker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. I know this is the difficult hour after lunch. So today I will be talking, I will be talking, but first, now we're good to go. All right. Thank you for your patience. Today I'll be talking to you about Towards a Humanitarian GI Science. And this work represents about 4 years of my own dissertation research. But I'd also like to mention that myself and my advisor, Dr. Alberto Giordano, we are now members of a regional working group for migrant mortality mapping and accounting along the US southwestern border. And recently this year we received NSF funding to support this ongoing research. So of course, I'll start by telling you what is this thing, humanitarian GI science, that we're talking about. And my intention is to spend as much time as possible with multiple maps that I've generated from my dissertation data. But first things first, what on earth is humanitarian GI science? In short, it is a mixed method approach. It is the application of spatial analytical perspectives and tools to genocide studies, spatial forensics, and in general, human rights topics and events. And importantly, the idea here is that we are putting into geographic practice humanitarian forensic action. Humanitarian forensic action, or HFA, is a phrase, a concept, an activity defined by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And in short, that's scientific investigations and activities to alleviate human suffering and protect the dignity of conflict and disaster victims. Now, throughout the remainder of my presentation, and quite frankly, my research as a geographer and a forensic anthropologist, you will hear me talk about unidentified deceased of probable migrants, border deaths. But what the heck does that mean? There's no agreed upon unified definition of what these things are. But for the purposes of this research, we are talking about the premature and avoidable deaths of persons whose movement or presence has been unauthorized and irregularized as they navigate or interact with state-made boundaries. So our purpose with this idea, with this concept, an epistemology and a toolkit, is to explicitly situate the interests and research of forensic anthropologists, geographers, and using the tools of geographic information science. For those of you who are not as familiar, forensic anthropologists, they study the human skeleton, human variation. And in the forensic world, frequently that means searching for and identifying human remains. Usually they're skeletal, they might be decomposing, but that's just a quick note on that. So in our view, the spatial analytical methods, visualization techniques, and tools of GI science are a way of bringing together these disciplines towards this establishment of humanitarian GI science. And the process that we use, and this 5-point process is very generalized on purpose. It is about locating missing and unidentified deceased, and this serves to account who's dying, where, when, and coming to understand that. But the humanitarian component is integral to this whole process, and usually that becomes obvious when remains are identified, but even if the forensic science is great and sound, it does not matter unless families know and believe your results and your answers as a scientist, as a public servant, nonprofit organization, what have you. So the phenomena of migrant deaths at the Texas-Mexico border serves as an example of humanitarian forensic science implementation. So what are we talking about? At least 8,000 migrant deaths have been reported on the US side of the border by Border Patrol since 1998. Researchers and medical examiners' offices along the American Southwest contend that those deaths are probably much higher, ranging in the thousands to tens of thousands. There is no single really good unified count of how much death is actually happening at our southwestern border. Currently, for the maps that exist, such as the one I have here, they are based on data from Arizona. And this map is produced by a nonprofit organization, Humane Borders, and the red dots are mortality locations. Arizona is the only southwest border state that has longitudinal migrant mortality data and metadata regarding the accuracy of the remains location, the coordinate locations. I also included a graph that's generated from statistics provided by Border Patrol, and that's just to show that border deaths, as reported by Border Patrol, they are trending, mind you, up in Texas, whereas they are high yet stable, so to speak, in Arizona. So while migrant deaths along the whole US border are considered a slow-moving mass disaster and humanitarian crisis, Texas, especially Brooks County, has been termed a death valley. So what's going on here? Unlike other southwest border states, Texas does not have a centralized medical examiner system. As a consequence, there are inconsistent record keeping that happens in Texas, especially South Texas, where the deaths seem to be the highest, reported the most. There's inconsistent adherence to Texas state laws regarding, for example, you must collect genetic samples from unidentified remains. That does not always happen. Additionally, there's limited county funding and state funding, there are limited personnel, and there's limited or sometimes no training, depending where you are in the state. Finally, private land ownership in Texas. Because of private land ownership, there are no systematic and regular searches for deceased individuals on the lands in Texas. So these Texas-specific challenges make it a key place to implement what we call humanitarian GI science. The research questions that guide us are, where do migrant deaths occur in South Texas? Basic, we got to start at the beginning. Account, locate. And how might an account of these deaths serve both forensic and humanitarian purposes? And finally, the big one, how does GI science ameliorate or propel these goals forward? So I've mentioned South Texas. What is that? South Texas, what we are calling it, is 10 counties in the tippy tip of Texas, so to speak, where migrant death is reportedly the highest. During my dissertation data collection phase, I was able to obtain over 1,400 law enforcement reports of unidentified deceased people who are probably migrants. Probable migrants meaning the context in which they were discovered, their personal effects and what have you, strong indicators that they were a migrant. These data came directly from sheriffs, justices of the peace, and Border Patrol themselves. And this data ranges from 2009 to 2020. I also conducted 57 IRB consented interviews and observations, and I collected over 500 local newspaper articles from Texas and Mexico that report on incidents of migrant death. Se hablo español. Just as a nugget, I threw on this slide the word uncertainties. Keep that in your mind. If I do my timing right, we'll be able to talk about it more towards the end of this presentation. This is just a locator map I produced. The little black speckles are the migrant mortality locations in Texas. Blue dots are local law enforcement, red dots are fire departments. They frequently perform rescues and remains recovery in collaboration with law enforcement. And then green are Border Patrol locations. So my research is mixed method. I used both ArcGIS Pro, the spatial statistics, standard distance, mean center, directional distribution, and I used SAT-SCAN, the space-time cluster analysis, to, for the first time for South Texas, construct a migrant mortality profile for a little over 10 years worth of data. Also, especially using the newspaper articles, I used qualitative spatial representation, QSR, to trace topological relationships communicated in this qualitative data, unstructured data, to begin to understand what is going on in South Texas. Now, it's beyond my time today, but me, and then with consulting with my advisor, I am working on the interview data using corpus linguistics to examine and assay what's going on in there as well. If there's time, I'll be able to show you some of the hand-drawn maps or Google images shared with me by participants, but won't get into those types of analyses for today. And our hope is to look into if social network analysis might be appropriate for heterogeneous data sets. So let's look at what I've done so far. The first three maps I'll show you, starting with this being map number 1, represent what's the word? Traditional GIS. And when I say that, I don't mean it in a disparaging way. I mean data that works in a Cartesian coordinate space. So these are spatial statistics in ArcGIS Pro that really just provide, again, for the first time, a description of what we have on migrant death in Texas. And hopefully what you can see immediately is how gappy or how much blank space appears in this map. And again, it is a consequence of going in person to get these records from law enforcement. But the other thing to take away from this image, and that what you'll actually see again in the next two, is that where there are deaths, it is right along the border itself, right along the Rio Grande River, and then gap, and up to 50 to 70 miles north of the border, again, you start getting these concentrations of death. So now this is generated from StatScan. This is space-time scan. This is where South Texas was treated as a single aerial unit, all 10 counties as one thing. 7 significant space-time clusters were detected, where a majority of these clusters, when the region is considered as a whole, happen to occur in winter months. Beyond that, the only thing I want to point out for this map, again, is that there's an awful lot of blank space, and there are an awful lot of significant clusters north of the actual border or inland of the actual border. Now, taking the same scan statistic, but going per county where there were sufficient number of cases, meaning over 100 within the county, ran the space-time scan again, 8 significant clusters were detected. Now on this one, let's just look at it visually. For the at-border counties, so they actually share a border with Mexico, the significant clusters fall relatively close to the Rio Grande River, the actual border. And then when you go inland, the near border counties, that would be Brooks County, our so-called Death Valley, and then Kennedy County, those clusters actually fall quite near major highways. And in interviews, frequently law enforcement would tell me that where they tend to encounter remains are near, but not too near, major roadways, because it's that, human calculus of finding the path toward the major city and then avoiding detection. But let's talk about QSR. Again, that's qualitative spatial representation. Thank you. What did I want to tell you about that? If you look at the table I've constructed, this is just an example of how I broke down each newspaper article that I collected. Again, this was from local newspapers, not national, so Texas and Mexico. And it is biased, but it is a free, ubiquitous source to get a sense of how these events permeate the daily awareness or life around people who happen to live in South Texas. So what QSR allows me or anyone to do is, instead of using mathematical equations, you use logic statements to establish and clarify topology communicated in text. So the organization, the triple, semantic triple is what I used. The construction is element relate element, thank you, or node arc node. So fire department an element is related to another element, the Rio Grande River, and the relate is conducting a search near, and so forth. So I'm running out of time, but what QSR allowed me to do, and I'm flipping through these somewhat quickly on purpose, is that it produced visualizations of networks of activities around death. And as I began to QSR these stories with the triple as the organization element, it allowed me to do a form of scaling up and summarizing chronologically, what is being experienced, at least as communicated in local news. So I was able to summarize what's going on in the late 1990s when Border Patrol's strategy of prevention through deterrence was established, and then in 2012, which was a huge year of death in Texas. And basically the QSRs were able to help me visualize the entry and exit of human remains or the entry and exit of a migrant death from public attention. So I've run out of time, so we don't get to show the maps shared with me by my interview participants. But concluding observations, where do migrant deaths occur? Again, these maps that I've produced, even though they're quite basic functions that I used in these GIS tools, it's a migrant mortality profile for South Texas, a little over 10 years of time. And they are found and reported close to Border Patrol interior checkpoints. So if a lot of effort is spent securing the southern border, why on earth are so many deaths seemingly occurring inland, right? How might this serve both forensic and humanitarian aims? Far more interesting than where the data actually is where it is not. And this is very indicative of Texas. There's a lack of access, private land, lack of documentation, absence of records. And what this all feeds into is how might GIS help this process? It allows us to situate local knowledge and traditional geospatial analyses together. We're still working on the integration part, but now we have more of a story all at once. So the blank spaces become areas for action. So in a nutshell, to accomplish humanitarian GIS science, juxtaposing heterogeneous data together can provide a better view of the situation. And importantly, as geographers, it offers a means to understand and develop place-specific action. Thank you. There's multiple types of funding, but I'll move on to questions if there's still time.
Thanks, Molly. I think we have time for some questions. Yeah.
Would you show us the maps, please?
Yes.
Yes, please.
The interview maps or the like GIS?
The interview maps.
Yeah, this one. Here you are. Frequently, multiple interviews. It was included in my RRB, map drawing optional exercise. When I talk to fire departments, when I talk to police, when I talk to NGOs, they're like, you know what, why don't I just show you? I know where people are dying. And this shows a river tour I was taken on with a rescue team from a fire department in South Texas. Yeah, it kind of shows up well. There are boat put-ins, and the X's are where they know remains will always wash up. And the calculus, mental calculus in their head, local knowledge, experience is that depending on the water level, this river bend is where the remains will show up on the US side, or this river bend is where they'll show up on the Mexican side. And while multiple interviewees would say something to the effect of, maps are great, it never supplanted their local experiences and their knowledge. So I have yet to find a way or think of a way where it might be useful to provide maps other than it might help them in the process of applying for federal grants to support their work they're already doing. And this is a hand-drawn map that actually represents 10 years of experience of a firefighter who worked in Laredo and Nueva Laredo, which are sister cities across the Rio Grande River. And again, you know, when the current is slow and high, Mexican side. When it's low and fast, US side. And the hand notes are on there are the firefighter explaining to me. So I do love this map very much.
We have an online question. Go ahead, Jay.
Let's take this one in the audience first, then we'll take the online one in a second.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. So my question is, a lot of your maps were located in the southern 1/3 of the border of Texas, Mexico. I'm curious why you weren't looking at the rest of the border. I don't know if that was just your area of interest or if there were some other drivers there.
So here, let me just pull up that locator. Why I'm working here.
Yeah, because I noticed like on your QSR, I think it was that was actually from Del Rio and Acuña, which is farther north of your study area.
Yeah, the original ambition was to do the entirety Texas-Mexico border based on time and access that didn't actually happen. But also, the QSRs are a systematic means to start figuring out what's happening in areas where there don't seem to be a lot of deaths happening. So a lot has changed in 2020 to now, 2022. There's been a lot of attention in Del Rio. That kind of attention, that large amount of migrant death has not happened there before as far as news media is concerned and as far as accounting is concerned from Border Patrol and local law enforcement. So there's a shift going on right now. But at the time that I developed this project, I was working with NGOs and sheriff's offices that me and my colleagues had relationships with, so we could get access to the data, and there were people on the ground we could be held accountable to.
Okay, thank you. Also, did you take a look at where you looked at the differentiation distribution, right? It's along the border and then it's up farther north.
Mm-hmm.
Did you look at that relationship with physical barriers? I mean, obviously there's the wall, but also geophysical barriers, such as terrain, elevation, land cover. There's a lot of land cover in southern Texas you just don't want to walk through.
It's true. So generally speaking, even with the DEM terrain models and what have you, this area is flat as a pancake, so to speak, but it is harsh environment in terms of temperature and the vegetation. A couple of colleagues of mine have a paper out for review where they did that modeling. But factoring in what people seem to be doing, it's still kind of follow the major roads, but far enough away to avoid detection. So regardless of what the terrain is, the main factor seems to be, what do we have to do to get past Border Patrol or local law enforcement, regardless of what a, say, least cost path analysis might tell you.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Thank
All right,
you.
thanks very much. It sounds like the question from online is not there anymore, so let's give a round of applause to Molly.